Okay, so we are going to talk about Jonathan Swift's Meditation Upon a Broomstick, and this piece was satirizing Robert Boyle's occasional reflections upon several subjects. And already we can sort of see how he's satirizing it just by listening to the two titles. They have a very similar sentence structure, especially using the exact same word upon. So what Boyle would do is he would sort of find this random object and then talk about it in a sort of philosophical way about how it related to things like humanity and religious themes and things of that nature. And Swift sort of thought this was stupid and pretentious. So what he did was he made a sort of mock piece that he masqueraded as a sort of testament to Boyle's work, but in fact it was actually a satire. And he just sort of wanted to mock Boyle's writing style and how he wrote and bring to light some of the sort of stupidity that these musings actually had. So it starts off with a fairly long paragraph just about how pitiful a broomstick is. And right off the bat, we have something ridiculous, something that is indicative of satire, which is someone feeling bad for a broomstick. And after he keeps talking about the broomstick, he finally says the line, "When I beheld this, I sighed, and said within myself, surely man is a broomstick." And I thought this was funny because it sort of sounds like something an emo teenager would say. It's very melodramatic and very over the top, which is something you'd probably see in a satire because they're sort of escalating the negative points of whatever they're satirizing in order to send a sort of message to the reader. So, and then he bolsters this comparison by talking about wigs and how people hide and shave their natural hair and then wear a wig instead. And this is compared to a broomstick by talking about how a tree is stripped bare and then it has bristles put on it. But the important part is that he talks about how wigs are bad. He also compares hair powder to dust that brooms broom up. And I actually Wikipedia'd Western fashion in the 1700s, and I sort of found the quote at the top of the page. It says, "Wigs remained essential for men of substance, and were often white. Natural hair was powdered to achieve the fashionable look." And when you sort of hear this, it changes the tone of the piece. Like, he's not talking about a specific person, he's talking about everyone. He's talking about how, just how people are bad, and people are, like, they're going away from their human nature because of fashion, and it's sort of misanthropic. He's attacking almost everyone for essentially a fashion choice. So, eventually you get to the second paragraph, and Swift sort of, he ditches the broom analogy about one sentence into the second paragraph, and he turns to this sort of strange mini-rant. He calls humans topsy-turvy, with their animalistic instincts sort of triumphing over their natural reasoning. And then he starts to sort of brag about humanity for a few sentences, calling them corrector of abuses and bringing hidden corruption to light. And then he goes back to sort of reprimanding humanity, talking about how they share the pollutions that they pretend to sweep away. And this is where we see more misanthropic themes. He talks about how humans are terrible, and we're all awful, and we're evil. And then suddenly, it's like, he sort of has these misogynistic statements. He says humanity's last days are spent in slavery of woman, and how they'll use you and then throw you away like kindling. And it's weird because it ends up not relating about humanity at all, but just sort of about how women are evil. And it really doesn't relate to the rest of the essay, which I find weird, but we're going to sort of talk about that later. And another thing that I found interesting, but doesn't really have to do with satire, is his last statement where he talks about how we're thrown into the kindling. It sort of mirrors the last statement that he says before he compares broomsticks to humanity. And it feels like a fulfilling last statement because of this repetition, and even though it doesn't really have anything to do with satire, it's sort of a neat trick that Swift uses in order to make his writing more fluid. So the important thing to note is that Jonathan Swift does not believe in any of this. He isn't a misanthrope, and he isn't a misogynist. In fact, the fact that he incorporated both of these things into his satire makes him less likely to believe in them. In reality, he's making fun of Boyle, who's more apt to believe in this sort of thing than Swift himself. However, we don't really know what Boyle believed in exactly, since we haven't read his work, so it's difficult to see the exact parallels from what Boyle wrote and what Swift satirized, because we really only have half of the equation here. But we can probably guess from what Swift emphasized, which sort of shows how good of a writer Swift is. Even without reading Robert Boyle's work, I can sort of get a feel for what it was like, and how, what Swift emphasized as the negative points of Boyle's essays. And that really sort of goes into the genius of Jonathan Swift's writing, is you can know how something was without actually reading it. So, what we can glean that Robert Boyle wrote from Swift's meditation upon a broomstick is that he probably relates two things, most likely humanity and some sort of trivial object like, say, a broomstick. And then he goes into this extremely glorified and pretentious investigation about how these things are similar, and usually there's some sort of stretch in order to make connections. And he starts to be very critical of things that matter very little in the long run, like things like fashion and wigs. And then there might have even been misogynistic undertones, like John Swift put near the end of his essay. So, to wrap things all up, Swift was writing to satirize Robert Boyle, who was someone who made irrational connections between two objects and wrote about them in relation to one another. And he achieved this by taking a completely ridiculous object, a broomstick, and then comparing it to humanity. He made it sound extremely pretentious by invoking themes of human nature and the degradation of man. And by degradation of man, I mean wearing wigs as opposed to your natural hair. And was it effective? Yeah, I think it was very effective. He got his point across in the first read-through for me, which is more than I can say for Hamlet. And as I talked about before, you can really understand what Robert Boyle wrote about without actually reading anything by Robert Boyle. So, overall, I think this was a pretty great introduction to sort of the mind of Swift and how he works, and the different literary techniques he uses. And honestly, I'm pretty excited to read more of his work. So, yeah. So, we are going to talk about